Hello and welcome. Today we will be continuing our tutorial series, doing a video on early industrialization. There's going to be a lot of topics that we cover. We're going to cover what do we mean by early industrialization, how do I know him kind of in this phase of the game. We're going to talk about ownership and laws. We're going to talk about peasants, encouraging manufacturing, tools-based economy. The TLDR of this video is you should just build tools. The importance of trade as it relates to being industrial, and also technology, kind of what are the techs that we're looking for early game as we're trying to get our economy off the ground. And the first thing we have to talk about is what do we mean by early industrial economy. There's a few heuristics you can use. One that I think is pretty good is if you're under 200 construction, you're probably in an early industrial economy. And also, if you have a really large percentage of your population as peasants, you're probably in an early industrial economy. If we take a look at what we have here in Iberia right now and go population, this is going to be kind of the number you look at where you're like, okay, how many peasants do I have here? Perfect. Now I have a good idea. If we take a look over here in Great Qing, for example, in this province, we will see that they are mostly peasants here. And so doing an early industrial effort would be what you would be doing here, regardless of the fact that the date is 1906, right? The heuristic that's probably the strongest, or the thing you want to look at, is how much of my or what percentage of my population is peasants. And the reason why this is important is because peasants can be employed for very, very, very cheap. And so while you have a large percentage of peasants or a large peasant population, this means labor is going to be very, very cheap. And also labor is available. And so what you want to do, or what you want to focus on when you are in an early industrial economy, is expanding construction as fast as possible. The reason why is construction, you can kind of think of construction as your GDP growth rate. The more construction you have, the more buildings you build, the more you can get the peasants working on other stuff, and this expands. Now, often you will want to focus on consumer goods and just whatever's most profitable, but very early game, you want to really focus on expanding construction as much as possible. This is what you want to do very early on, and this is what informs largely what you're going to be building, which is mainly what we're going to be talking about today, what you're building and why you're building it. The second thing that we are focused on in an early industrial economy is the industrial portion. If we take a look at buildings and we take a look at ownership at the start of the game, everything that is rural, that is arable land, will be owned privately, and they will be owned by aristocrats. Now, the aristocrats contribute to the investment pool, but they contribute significantly less than capitalists do. At the start of the game, you might have, logging camps, which are simple forestry, and these are owned by merchant guilds, which will be primarily shopkeepers who also don't contribute very much to the investment pool. But if you switch the PMs, and this is important, the PMs are really important. If you switch to sawmills, now they will be owned by capitalists, and capitalists give the most contribution to the investment pool, and this is a big part of how you can start building a lot early on. Early on, tax methods are not really available to you that give you a very large share of the money pie. So one of the ways you're really reliant on early on in the game is you're going to be heavily reliant on the investment pool contribution in order to give you money to build with. The investment pool can be used for all construction goods, and it will be transferred over. Now let's take a quick look here, hovering right here. This investment pool is going to give you way more, or the capitalists just give a way larger percentage. So you want as high percentage of your population capitalist as possible, which means trade is going to be very, very important for that, but more on that later. So the PMs are also very, very important. Early on, you will start off with a ton that actually force you onto merchant guilds. So for example, crude tools is merchant guild owned. So the text that will be really important to early on in order to get you off of this is lathes is going to be very important because it allows you to use dye works, which the textile mills will move from being merchant guild owned to capitalist owned. Lathes for furniture manufacturing, same idea, and crystal glasswork, same idea. Almost every country in the game starts out with steelworking, but steelworking is what allows you to use wrought iron tools and also allows you to use sawmills, and this is going to be the most important tech, given what we are going to be doing is focusing on expanding construction as much as possible. Just real quick, I want to cover the laws that are kind of important, or a good way to think about laws early on, just the laws that are going to be important. You want to get off of traditionalism as much as possible, because this absolutely hoses the investment pool contribution. And so this is going to be, in terms of laws, which isn't the focus of this video, you want to get off of traditionalism as much as possible and on to interventionism or laissez-faire. Agrarianism's okay. You also want to try and enact as profitable a tax rate as you can in order to be able to pour that money into construction. And also, as far as budget goes, late game, you actually want to decrease taxes quite a bit, but you can increase taxes quite a lot when you are in an early industrial economy, and the reason why is the labor is kind of always available. Late game, you decrease taxes in order to raise standard of living and promote migration, and also increase consumption, because you will have a very consumption-based economy. But early game, you will not have really consumption-based economies, so money going back into the hands of your pops and them spending it on goods. When you don't have factories for the goods, it's not a very useful thing, and when you don't need migration because you have so many peasants, it's not a very useful thing. So having high taxes early, and also consumption taxes, particularly focusing on luxury goods and sin taxes, will allow you to extract as much money as possible for as much construction as possible. And the principle for how much money you want to be spending is, if you are a recognized country, this is important, if you are a recognized country, you can deficit spend into maybe a quarter debt, somewhere in that, or a third debt, or maybe even half if you have laissez-faire. Laissez-faire allows you to deficit spend more strongly in terms of how you want your balance to be. If you are an unrecognized country, do not go into debt and do not pay interest. Interest is way more expensive for an unrecognized country. You get a way worse interest rate. Great powers get something like minus 50% interest, and I think an unrecognized power gets like plus 50% interest, so they're paying 3 times as much on the interest. It's not a good deal if you are unrecognized. Very important to emphasize. Okay. So, we talked about being at a deficit, we talked about economic system, taxes, etc., and now we want to talk about, okay, well, what buildings do I build for this? Everything is going to be about just expanding construction as much as possible. At the start of the game, you start with wooden buildings. So this means you are going to build a lot of construction centers here, and what do they use? They use wood and fabric. So what you're going to be doing is you are going to creating as much a circle as possible, in terms of you are going to be building construction buildings, and then the only other thing you're going to be building is stuff that gives the construction goods, which will decrease the price of construction, which will allow you to build more construction, which will make the goods more expensive, and then you'll just build the goods. So it's just a circle. And so what you are going to be focused on early is the wooden buildings. You're going to be just doing chops. That's pretty much it. And you're going to be building the wooden buildings. Now, generally speaking, you can transition very, very quickly to iron frame buildings. Okay? Unless you are playing a country that somehow doesn't have this available, early on and very early, you're going to want to transfer to iron frame buildings if you can. Again, it's going to be important that you make all these goods cheap before you transfer. And you notice they use tools, fabric, wood, and iron. So these are the goods you're going to want to make, and you're going to want to be focused again. Going back to who owns the buildings, you're going to be wanting to focus on the ones that are owned by capitalists. Now, one of these stands out. Fabric, right? Fabric is built or is created in cotton plantations. If we take a look at the buildings here, we can take a look at, let's find a cotton plantation. So it's this one in Catalonia. At the start of the game, you're going to be on basic production and you're going to be on privately owned, something like this. Okay? This is going to be owned by an aristocrat. Generally, we don't want the aristocrats because they pay less to the investment pool, and also they empower the landowners, which is a separate thing. It's more about politics, but the landowners are a bad interest group that we want not really empowered in order to pass the stuff we want. So, what we are going to do for the fabric specifically, you want to import it. And you're going to want to import everything that is landowner based. That way, especially in 1.2, the automatic investment pool doesn't start building a bunch of landowner based buildings. And instead, what you can do is you can just import all the goods as much as you can. So this means you are going to want to import, we can filter certainly. No, we can't filter by that. Okay, so what we're going to want to import is going to be all the goods that are going to be landowner owned. So this is going to mean dyes. This is going to be the luxuries like tea, tobacco, coffee, etc. It's going to be fabric you want to import, silk you want to import. All of these you want to focus mainly on importing, and if you are not on free trade, you are going to want to prioritize imports to try and make it as cheap as possible without you producing it yourself. That way you can focus on what is generally going to be capitalist built. So this brings us to the tools, the wood, and the iron. Early on, one of the fastest ways you can start getting capitalists is going to be by switching from simple forestry to sawmills, which is going to be privately owned by capitalists. So the first step is going to be you build some chop chops, and then you build the tools, and then you switch to sawmills. After this, we're going to take a look at the tooling workshops PMs. Crude tools is not capitalist owned. You'll notice we have shopkeepers who do not contribute very much to the investment pool. So what we are going to want to do is we're going to want to switch to wrought iron tools. Here, let's turn this off so we get a better idea. We're going to switch to wrought iron tools. Now, wrought iron tools requires iron. Luckily for us, what you need in order to get iron, let's pull this up here, is tools. So the input for iron is going to be tools, which is why you generally start focusing on tools early. You're seeing this cycle. Our construction goods, we need wood. Wood, in order to make it owned by capitalists, you need tools in order to use sawmills. Early tool working workshops use just wood, but then later they use iron. In order to harvest iron, you need the tools. Let's go in here, and let's just take a look at the PM for iron mines. Go to Western Andalusia. You'll start off with just all the basic PMs, right? And your only input will be tools. So in order to get the iron, you need the tools, and then, okay, so you're going to get the iron, you're going to get the tools, and then you're going to switch the tooling workshops. Oop, we don't want to subsidize it. You're going to switch the tooling workshops up to wrought iron tools, right? And now they are capitalist owned, which is going to give more to the investment pool. And okay, well, what's the problem? The problem is the iron's not capitalist owned. So I think it's Eastern Andalusia. Where did we put our thing? Western Andalusia. Here we go. Now we want to switch to atmospheric engine pump. Once we do this, which is going to take coal, then we will be privately owned here. And everything that we are building the chop chops, the tools, the atmospheric engine pump, the iron, and also it's going to be adding, we're going to need coal. All of these are privately owned and all feed into the construction. And you'll notice the only thing that is not feeding into the construction is the fabric which we import. Okay? And so gradually this will allow you to ramp up as quickly as possible, focusing in this way. Now, you're going to, at a certain point, reach a point where your pops need or demand goods, and you are going to have the option of either importing those goods or building them yourself. Generally speaking, I think after a certain point, the tooling workshops, you're going to look at the weekly balance and it's going to start going down. You can do two things, and you should probably be doing both. First, you can export tools in order to make the building more profitable. Now, the reason you want to export tools is you can build the tooling workshop up higher and higher in order to get a larger throughput bonus from economies of scale. So just building more and more, even if you're not using them, still has a use because you get a larger and larger throughput bonus from economies of scale. And this bonus is an increasing bonus. What I mean by that is when you have one tooling workshop, you have 0 bonus. When you have 2 tooling workshops, you have a 1% bonus. So it's like that second tooling workshop is worth 102% of a building because you get the 1% on the building that you just constructed, but also the 1% on the previously building. When you build the 51st tooling workshop, which gives you the max economies of scale throughput bonus, it gives you effectively 200% of a building. You get 150% because the one you just built has the 50% throughput bonus. And on the previous 50 buildings, you each bring them up from 49% throughput to 50% throughput, which gives a total of another 50%. So it's like 200% of a building. And so getting economies of scale up high is really important. What throughput does, by the way, is it keeps wages the same, but it increases the inputs and the outputs by that percentage. So throughput is going to be better and better the higher a percentage of the total cost is in wages, which early on it will tend to be higher, because then you get to steel tools, for example. It's going to increase the price of, you know, the input goods, and when you add like assembly lines, it's going to increase the price of all the inputs. So throughput is, generally speaking, more important earlier on, but as labor becomes more scarce, labor will become more expensive, which in turn kind of pushes the value of throughput. But that's a little bit of a separate discussion more about throughput. We're talking about building up as best as possible for the iron frame buildings. Okay, now, the second thing is, or the second you're going to add is, generally speaking, your pops with SOL 10 to 20, the biggest thing that they consume, other than grain, which you should import, because it is landowner based, you should be importing grain, is going to be clothes. And I recommend building clothes yourself in addition to the tools for a few reasons. Let's downgrade all these PMs to kind of what you have at the start of the game and talk about it. Now, the clothes are going to be extremely profitable, and they are going to be the thing your pops demand from SOL 10 to 20. A lot of your SOL will still be really low because you'll have a lot of peasants, so this will actually be, they'll be consuming grain, they'll be consuming services, which you don't have very direct control over, and they'll be consuming grain, services, and clothes. These are the big three, but also clothes will eventually require a ton of tools to use. So let's talk about it. You'll want to switch to dye workshops as quickly as possible, because this switches you off merchant guilds to it switches you off merchant guilds to privately owned, which again, capitalists. Capitalists give the most investment pool contribution out of any pop owner type, and so this is where you want to be early on when you have a ton of peasants, again, when you are an early industrial economy. Eventually we'll get craftsman sewing and elastics and this sort of stuff. Let's put it on craftsman sewing. And the one I'm going to talk about here is mechanized looms. We're going to talk a little bit about tech here. Mechanized looms consumes a bunch of tools. So if you're building a bunch of tools, it's nice to increase demand for tools, which will make them more profitable. This will also be the case with sewing workshops, which will further increase the demand for tools. And this is part of like the important tech, where we're going in terms of tech, which we're going to talk about next. But clothes are going to be an important one, because your pops are going to be desperate for consuming clothes, especially as they start coming out from being peasants, out of the subsistence farms. They're going to have increased demands, and as you build more and more tooling workshops and chop chops and mines, there's going to be a larger and larger demand for clothes. You can import them, but I recommend fulfilling it yourself and having a secondary good after the tools and the mining and the chop chops being the clothing. But again, fulfilling your pop's needs is not as important when you are really, really early on. Let's talk about techs now. We've talked a lot about PMs and these sorts of things, and we're going to talk about all the techs, or the tech, kind of where we go in the tech. Almost everyone will start with steelworking. This is the most important tech. It gives you sawmills and wrought iron tools, which we talked about, which allow you to be privately owned on the chop chops and the tooling workshops, respectively. Most countries will not start out with cotton gin and lathe. In terms of industrialization, you are going to want to go cotton gin, lathe, make sure you have all of the tier 1 techs, and then you are going to want to go into atmospheric engine, and then mechanical tools as it relates to industrializing as fast as possible. The reason atmospheric engine gives you the capitalists and all of the mines, which you are using to be on, you know, your latest and greatest iron frame buildings. Here we go, which is allowed earlier on, but if you have a ton of mines and they're just merchant guild owned, you will not be getting as big an investment pool contribution, which is important. So coming back to the tech, this also makes water tube boiler important early on, but there's an atmospheric engine event, and you generally want to pop the event first. If you research mechanical tools before you pop the event, you can get the event to go towards railroad. If you do it without, you can only do water tube boiler in terms of getting some extra tech spread, kind of a bit of a different thing. Mechanical tools will unlock steel workshops for tooling workshops, which is just a more efficient PM. It's also capitalist owned, but since most of what you have is tools, getting this tech is going to be really important. The higher a percentage of your economy that is tied in a single type of output or a single type of finished good, the greater and more valuable the techs are going to be. since almost our entire economy is going to be tools and mines and chops, these three techs together are going to do so much, and it's going to make your research effectively more efficient as it relates to how much it's going to expand your economy. It also unlocks slaughterhouses, which uses tools. There's a few tools that get used in rural areas that you can turn on as well, and sulfide pumping for paper mills, which turns paper mills into capitalist owned, which is nice. You can import paper, but I recommend building your own paper yourself, because losing supply of paper is strategically horrific, but in terms of economy, importing it might be better early on, just so you can focus more on tools and the mines. And then eventually you're going to need railways to build tall, more on that later. Or let's just talk about building tall right now. Generally speaking, for most of what you're doing, you're going to want to find one province to build up really tall that has a high population of peasants and has a lot of arable land, because this is caps in terms of how much migration you can get. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go into the decrees panel and put encouraging manufacturing in that province, which is going to give a 20% throughput bonus from economies of scale, or not from economies of scale, it's a 20% bonus from encouraged manufacturing industry, which is going to increase the throughput. Okay, let's go back to the technology and finish talking about it. Railways, if you're building tall in one place, is going to be an important tech, and so we're seeing this sort of thing. And then there's one last tech that's extremely important. Now remember, earlier I said you're going to want to build a lot of clothes, because clothes is what your pops are going to demand when they are still relatively low standard of living. It's going to be clothes, grain, and services. Mainly clothes and grain for the lower rung pops, especially. They don't really consume luxury goods. And mechanized workshops, very importantly, gives plus 10 to economies of scale throughput bonus. At the start of the game, the throughput bonus cap is 20%, mechanized workshops makes it 30%, and shift work will make it 50%. But also, it's going to unlock sewing machines and mechanized looms and mechanized workshops for furniture manufacturers. Now, let's take a look at these PMs really quick. When we switch on to sewing machines, it is going to produce a ton more regular clothes, and when we switch to mechanized workshop, it is going to save labor. If we're building tall in one place and we're encouraging manufacturing there, this labor-saving PM is probably going to be really nice, because chances are the standard of living and the wage in this area that we're building tall is going to be pretty high. In terms of like what your eternal economy is, it's going to be somewhat important to have no migration controls, so people can travel to a place you're building tall. If you have migration controls or you have closed borders, you're going to need to spread out your industry a little bit more, but this is just something to think about. But this is going to when you research mechanized workshop and you have almost all tools and you have clothing, you just pop off really hard, and it feels very nice. And generally this is kind of a transition or an ending to an early industrial economy when you research mechanized workshops and you kind of just build a ton of clothes and a ton of tools. Once it has more to do with how many peasants you have, but this is kind of a good heuristic or a good sign that you should start expanding more into other goods, other than, you know, tools and clothing. By the way, the tools, once you research mechanical tools, will require steel. You build the steel yourself, and then also engines will be required for railways, these sorts of things. But for the most part, it's focusing on tools, exporting tools, not really trying to export the steel and the engines as much, just building them as needed. And again, building these when they're really profitable. So what you're going to want to do is like build tools and then build textile mills, and whichever one is the most profitable or has the biggest weekly balance, you're going to want to kind of just build more of those. And the big reason why you're focusing on the weekly balance is because the investment pool contribution will be based on how much in excess of just regular operating costs the capitalists are making. They only contribute, you know, in terms of their profits, which again is going to be really important for throughput, because throughput will generally increase profits, and it will increase profits a lot more when you have a lot of peasants, because that will keep the price of the labor down. The labor will not rise as the throughput rises. You'll have a really low average annual wage, and this will allow the buildings to be really profitable and you to harvest a very large economies of scale throughput bonus. Let's see, we talked a little bit about trade already, remembering that we want to import specifically grain, dyes, fabric, and silk are going to be the really big ones, but also you can import, meat, tobacco, all this, especially with the automated construction queue, because what's going to happen is, in terms of our goods, if we have really expensive meat, the automated queue is going to build ranches. We don't want ranches. We don't want livestock farms. We want to focus on industrial goods. The reason why is the livestock farms are owned by aristocrats, and the aristocrats don't contribute as much to the investment pool. And so you will just want to, you have this extra layer of control by importing all these goods as much as possible, especially if they're expensive, this sort of thing. We talked about a little bit about peasants, and taxes and SOL. Let's just generally talk about a little bit about the peasants again, or just focus on the peasants. The peasants are going to be a huge feature of what is making the economy an early industrial economy, because it keeps the price of labor low. And also the peasants, let's find a subsistence farm and talk about it. The subsistence farm will have several outputs into your economy that mainly just cover what the peasants need. They're going to be grain, liquor, services, clothes, etc. Some of this stuff, which is also partly why, you have a decent fabric and wood to start constructing immediately. But also why you can tax liquor and services at the start of the game is having to do with this. But as they start coming out of here, these are going to be the goods that your pops need. So if your pops are working in a tooling workshop, for example, they're still going to want all of these goods, basically. And so this is why you want to go for clothes kind of earliest. Furniture is less important, but you can go for furniture as well. I generally prefer clothes to furniture because I think the PMs are stronger, and also your pop's demand for clothes is a lot more significant than their demand for furniture, but okay. But also, you're going to be getting way less grain into your economy as the populations move off of the subsistence farm, so it's going to be important to import that grain if you can. And then also, we talked about technology, we talked about, okay, so another feature is when you have a ton of peasants, you generally will get really, really poor migration. The reason why is labor is really cheap, so it's hard to have a really high standard of living. Your standard of living will stay flat. If you've ever played a game as China, your standard of living stays flat for a really long time because you just have so many peasants to work through. An important feature that becomes really important once you start transitioning out of peasants is going to be encouraging migration. Now, this is talking about, when you're transitioning to a later sort of economy, not an early economy. But you do not really need to care about migration really early on, which is part of the reason why, if you take a look at what your pops are consuming and just the overview in their needs, you don't really need to cater as much to their needs because one of the positives of keeping these goods cheap is you increase standard of living without increasing wages, which allows you to attract more migration. But if you're not attracting any migration because wages are depressed anyways, then it's not going to be as important. And so just something to think about is when you are going to turn a corner or when you are starting to run out of peasants, migration becomes an important feature, and then it becomes much more important to, get the porcelain, get the croissants, get the luxury goods. And also, glass and steel become more important later on because they are part of the goods that you use for construction. Again, construction is effectively, the growth of your economy. And so glass comes in, steel comes in, all these sorts of stuff. So you kind of do want to have a little bit of steel getting ready for the transition, but you should have already pulled most of your peasants out from the subsistence farms by the time you're getting towards steel frame buildings. Anyways, just really quick recap. When you are in an early industrial economy is when you have a ton of peasants, or when you're under 200 construction, I think is kind of a good heuristic. You want to focus on building buildings that contribute to construction goods, and this is kind of the main shebang, what you're focusing on. Building stuff that's tools, wood, and iron. You import the fabric, and this is how you focus. You try and get as much capitalists as possible because they contribute the most to the investment pool. In terms of ownership and laws, real quick, it is going to be very important to be on an economic system that has good contribution. Traditionalism's really bad. Laissez-faire is good, but laissez-faire takes away control. I think in an early industrial economy, laissez-faire is bad, and then later laissez-faire is good, because laissez-faire, they will build a ton of the consumer goods, because the consumer goods will generally be very, very profitable, instead of focusing really in on the tools, the mines, and all this sort of stuff to really let you ramp up construction as quickly as possible. So I think interventionism is best. You're going to want a tax systems that's good. As you start running out of peasants, it's going to be very important to get no migration controls, as well as, you know, starting to go towards multiculturalism and total separation. These types of things, but this is a sort of different consideration as to when you transition. As far as what we're building, mainly focusing on tools, focusing on building tall. The reason we're building tall is to try and chase a large economies of scale throughput bonus, which is small at first, but it has increasing marginal returns. So for every additional building you build, the throughput bonus gets more and more valuable. And doing this will allow the buildings to be more profitable. The more profitable the building, the more they contribute to the investment pool, because the investment pool contribution is based on the amount of profits that the capitalists have. And so this is why it's going to be important. Also, if you're building tall in just a single province, you can minimize the amount of authority needed to just encourage manufacturing in the places where you have a lot of industry. So this is important. Covering trade real quick, you want to be importing all of the goods that are landowner based that your pops are going to be consuming, or that are just all going to be consumed at all. So this means especially fabric, because fabric is used for both clothing and as well for construction, but you're going to want to be importing, you know, the luxury goods, coffee, tea, etc. The etc. being like opium and the other one. Dyes, silk, fabric, wine, all these sorts of stuff, sugar, fruit, meat. You just want to be importing all of it. And this is even more important in 1.2, because in 1.2, you are going to have an automated investment pool, and this investment pool is going to build a lot of consumer goods. And so you don't really mind as much if they're building like, canneries and like this sort of stuff, but you do mind if it's building agrarian goods, because you are trying to build an economy that allows for as much construction as possible, because construction is effectively your economic growth, which is going to involve having more capitalist goods than having, you know, landowner-owned goods. As a general heuristic, you want to be on off of aristocrats as much as possible. And yeah, that's about it. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. If you have specific topics you want covered, feel free to put them in the comments. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe, etc. YouTube algo stuff, it helps. If you didn't like the video, why'd you watch to the end? Is thing one. You should probably be more aggressive about changing the video. But thing two, if you don't like my videos at all, you can always click back to wherever you were able to click on it. And there's this 3-button thing, and you can click that and then click don't show this channel. Anyways, hope you enjoyed. Hope you're not in that party. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe. Already said that. And have a good one.